Jerry Nadler thought the concept of giving the Starr report was absolutely something you could never do. But when it comes to the Mueller report, which is different on our side, that would be something that he should get. It's hypocrisy and it's a disgrace. I will say this, look, there was no collusion, there was no obstruction. They were very disappointed. I don't know what they were thinking, because they all know. I guarantee you they go into a room between Nadler, Schiff, and the group, and they laugh like hell at how they've kept this thing going for 2 years. They laugh like hell. We went through 2 years of the Mueller investigation. We have, I mean, not only that, you read the wording, it was proven. Who could go through that and get wording where it was no collusion, no nothing? This thing has gone on for 2 years. And really, it started long before that. It practically started from the time I came down the escalator, because this was a whole plot. I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the investigation, the beginnings of that investigation.
What's going on there?
Well, it's his favorite fruit, I guess, oranges. He likes to refer to it.
This is the thing I was talking about earlier. It was a little, he didn't have a great day yesterday.
No.
In terms of the investigation?
He said the oranges, and then he said the oranges, and then he got to the origins, and then he got kind of confident. He tried origins again and said oranges.
Yeah.
Okay.
3 out of 4 oranges.
It's just weird.
Yeah, he's tired. Tired in a kind of existential way.
Something's on his mind. The president yesterday, again, calling for the investigators to be investigated and to look at the oranges. This, as Politico notes, that President Trump has unmistakably reined in his previous zeal for releasing the report publicly, which he first telegraphed last week while claiming that Mueller had totally exonerated him, which the report says it's not a complete exoneration. A senior administration official told New York Magazine that while White House staffers celebrated the probe's end, many want to, quote, put this behind us, with a fear Trump has oversold his explanation. Today, the House Judiciary Committee is likely to authorize a subpoena to get special counsel Robert Mueller's full report from the Justice Department. But Democratic Chairman Jerry Nadler may wait a few days before sending the subpoena to Attorney General William Barr in hopes of avoiding a court battle. Joining us now, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Congressman, thank you very much for being on this morning.
My pleasure.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
So, will the American public see the Mueller report? When is that going to happen, and how will it happen?
Yes, the American people are going to see the report, and they have every right to. It was their taxpayer dollars that went into Bob Mueller's work. He spent 2 years undertaking that investigation, and now it appears the president is completely changing his tune. I think he realizes that the Barr summary, this 4-page summary by his hand-picked attorney general, is about as good as it's going to get for him, because it doesn't go through the evidence on either the conspiracy or the obstruction issues. But the American people have a right to see it. Indeed, I think they have a need to see it, and we're going to have this fight if we have to. Barr testified at his confirmation that he would be as transparent as law and policy allow. Well, law and policy allow that whole report to be released. He should be going to court to seek the court permission to release grand jury material, not seeking to redact it and fight the Congress from getting it.
Mr. Chairman, it's Willie Geist. Good to see you this morning. So I think we all at this table as journalists agree we'd like to see the full report as well and be able to sift through it and see what evidence is in there and what evidence may not be in there. But do you believe that the Attorney General William Barr maliciously is misinterpreting the special counsel's report here?
Look, I don't think that he has misrepresented the ultimate conclusions in the report, although he's a very careful lawyer, and we won't know until we get that report just what those conclusions mean. What were the elements of proof that Bob Mueller couldn't find? Was it an issue of whether they were conspiring with the Russian government as opposed to Russian individuals, or was there insufficient proof of an actual implicit or tacit agreement? How does the special counsel explain all of those interactions between the Trump campaign and the Russians? And perhaps most important, on the obstruction charge, did Mueller intend for this attorney general who applied for the job by talking about how bogus the obstruction case was. Did Mueller really intend for him to be the decision maker, or did he intend that to go to the Congress, as in Watergate? So these questions and much more will be before us until we see, but I don't think that he affirmatively is trying to misrepresent, but I do think that we are seeing the most positive interpretation that this hand-picked attorney general could give.
But do you accept the fundamental conclusion in that 4-page letter that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians?
I accept Mueller's conclusion, and I assume Barr wouldn't misrepresent this, that he could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt the crime of conspiracy. But as I've said all along, there's plenty of evidence of collusion and corrupt commingling of work between the Trump campaign and the Russians. But I fully accept as a prosecutor that he couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that crime. And as you know, because I've made this distinction on your show, I've always said, well, there was ample evidence of collusion in the public record. Right. Whether Bob Mueller could prove the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt would be up to him, and I would accept his judgment, and I do.
Well, you're right. You've said on this show and others that there is direct evidence of collusion. Were you wrong about that now that you've seen the summary of the Special Counsel's report?
No, because I think what you see in the public record is direct evidence. When the Russians, through an intermediary, offered dirt on the Clinton campaign as part of what's described as the Russian government's effort to help the Trump campaign, and Donald Trump's son, who played a pivotal role in that campaign, says, if it's what you say it is, I would love it, and sets up a meeting to receive that. That is very direct evidence of collusion.
And so why do you suspect then, Mr. Chairman, that Robert Mueller, after 2 years of investigation, couldn't reach that conclusion himself?
Well, we won't know until we get the report. But even looking at that fact pattern, Mueller could conclude that the Trump campaign didn't know that this was in fact the Russian government, even though it was portrayed as the Russian government, or that the dirt they got during that meeting wasn't sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt conspiracy, or these other interactions with other Russians, with Kilimnik, believed to be linked to Russian intelligence, the offer of polling data, that maybe there wasn't a sufficient link that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt between Kilimnik and the Russian government. We simply won't know until we see the report. But there's no explaining away the eagerness of the president that he demonstrated publicly to have Russian help. Hey, Russians, if you're listening, hack Hillary's emails. There's no doubt that the Russians did, in fact, hack Democratic emails. There's no doubt about the social media operation. There's no doubt about how the president touted the WikiLeaks releases. All of this is in the public domain. And whether it's criminal or not, as I said the other day in committee, it's deeply unpatriotic, unethical, and corrupt.
So, Congressman, what does the committee do if the report comes to you and it's so thoroughly redacted that there's really not much involved publicly? Things that you've been mentioning about. What steps do you take?
Well, you know, then we have to go through with the subpoenas and the court fight to make sure that we get that information. And I also want to point out, it's not just the report. In our committee, the Intelligence Committee, we are our paramount interest is in the counterintelligence investigation, and that's how this all began, an investigation by the FBI into whether the president or people around him were acting wittingly or unwittingly as agents of a foreign power or under foreign influence, whether they were acting because of financial incentives like Moscow Trump Tower. That may not even be part of this report, but that may have the most impact in terms of our national security going forward.
Are you going to call Bob Mueller to testify?
I think it's inevitable Bob Mueller is going to have to testify before Congress. I would think that he will probably be needed before more than one committee. We'll have an interest in his testimony or others on the issue of the counterintelligence findings. And the Judiciary Committee, maybe the Oversight Committee as well, might have an interest in other aspects of investigation. But in the Intel Committee, we have a statutory requirement that the intelligence community, FBI, brief us on any significant counterintelligence or intelligence activity. And it's hard to imagine something that rises more to that level than this investigation.
All right, Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be watching. Coming up, Boeing's global fleet of 737 MAX jetliners is still grounded, and Congress is demanding answers. We've got new reporting from NBC's Tom Costello at Reagan National. And as we go to break, an update on the Pennsylvania special election we told you about yesterday in a bellwether state Senate district that Donald Trump carried by 6 points. The Democrat, Pam Iovino, has flipped the seat in the Pittsburgh suburbs with a 7-point victory in a district held by Republicans for most of the last 50 years. We're back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.